It was Tuesday evening, that dead zone between the promise of a new week and the distant hope of Friday. The city hummed around me with its usual indifferent energy, cars rushing past on their way to somewhere important, people walking with purpose I envied, their lives apparently organized enough that they didn't drop their keys down storm drains like some cosmic punchline. I pulled out my phone to call my landlord, but the screen remained black. Dead. Of course it was dead. I'd forgotten to charge it again, too absorbed in my own thoughts to remember such basic maintenance of living. The weight of my own carelessness settled over me like a familiar coat, heavy and uncomfortable but somehow reassuring in its predictability. My name is David, and I've always been the kind of person who exists in the margins of other people's stories. At 28, I'd perfected the art of being present, but not quite there, of participating in life without fully inhabiting it. I worked at a small graphic design firm downtown, the kind of place where creativity went to die a slow, corporate death, and I was good at it precisely because I never caused problems, never asked for too much, never made waves that might disturb the carefully maintained mediocrity of our daily routine. The apartment building loomed above me, its red brick facade catching the last traces of daylight. I'd lived there for 3 years, long enough that the mailman knew my name and the woman at the corner market always asked about my weekend plans. Plans that typically involved reading, maybe watching a movie, occasionally attempting to cook something more ambitious than pasta. It wasn't much of a life, but it was mine. And right now, it felt impossibly distant. I tried the front door, knowing it would be locked, but going through the motions anyway. The brass handle turned uselessly in my hand, confirming what I already knew. I could wait for another tenant to come home, but it was early evening on a Tuesday. Not exactly prime time for people returning from their vibrant social lives. That's when I noticed him. He was sitting on the front steps of the building next door, a man I'd seen before in passing but never really looked at. Not looked at in the way you actually see someone, the way you register them as more than just another moving part in the machinery of urban existence. He appeared to be in his early 40s, with dark hair that caught silver at the temples, and the kind of face that suggested he'd been handsome once and was slowly, gracefully, becoming something more interesting than handsome. Weathered, thoughtful, marked by experiences I could only guess at. He was reading a book, holding it at an angle that caught what remained of the natural light, and there was something about his posture, shoulders slightly hunched, head tilted in concentration, that spoke of someone comfortable with solitude. Someone who, like me, had made peace with being alone but maybe wasn't entirely happy about it. Our eyes met over the small fence that separated our building's front areas, and for a moment we both froze in that awkward recognition of two people who'd been existing in parallel for months without ever acknowledging each other's presence. He had dark eyes, brown or maybe hazel. It was hard to tell in the fading light, and they held a kind of quiet intelligence that made me immediately self-conscious about my current predicament. "Locked out?" he asked, and his voice was exactly what I would have expected if I'd ever bothered to imagine it. Low, careful, with the slight rasp of someone who didn't waste words on unnecessary conversation. I nodded, feeling heat creep up my neck. "Dropped my keys down there," I said, gesturing toward the storm drain. "And my phone's dead, so I can't call my landlord." He closed his book, marking his place with what looked like a coffee shop receipt, and stood up. He was taller than I'd expected, maybe 6 feet, with the lean build of someone who stayed in shape without making a production of it. He wore dark jeans and a gray sweater that looked soft, expensive in the understated way that suggested good taste rather than showing off. "That's rough," he said, walking to the low fence that separated our buildings. Up close I could see that his eyes were definitely hazel, shot through with flecks of green and gold. "I'm Mark, by the way. I live in 3B. He gestured toward the building behind him. "David," I replied. 2A. I pointed lamely at my own building, as if he might not have figured that out already. We stood there for a moment in the kind of silence that feels loaded with possibility, the air between us charged with the awkwardness of two strangers trying to figure out how much social interaction this situation required. I found myself studying his hands where they rested on the fence. Long fingers, no wedding ring, calloused in a way that suggested he worked with them. Did things more substantial than pushing pixels around a computer screen all day. "Look," Mark said, and there was something tentative in his voice, as if he was testing the words before committing to them. "I know we don't really know each other, but if you want to use my phone to call your landlord, you're welcome to come up. I mean, unless you'd rather wait out here." The offer hung in the air between us, and I found myself weighing it in that careful way I approached most decisions, analyzing all the potential complications, the ways it could go wrong, the social obligations it might create. But the alternative was standing on the sidewalk for however long it took for another tenant to show up. And something about Mark's manner, the way he'd offered help without making a big deal of it, without acting like he was performing some great act of kindness, made the choice easier than it should have been. "That would be great, actually," I said. "Thank you." He nodded and headed toward his building's front door, and I followed, acutely aware of the sound of my footsteps on the concrete, the way my jacket rustled when I moved, the ordinary sounds of existing that suddenly felt amplified in the presence of someone new. Mark's building was laid out exactly like mine, but somehow it felt different. Warmer, maybe, or just less familiar in a way that made me more conscious of being a guest in someone else's space. We climbed the stairs to the third floor, our footsteps echoing in the narrow stairwell, and I found myself watching the way he moved, unhurried, economical, like someone who'd long ago figured out exactly how much energy each task required and never spent more than necessary. "Here we are," he said, stopping in front of 3B and fishing his keys out of his pocket. I noticed he kept them on a simple metal ring, no decorative keychain or unnecessary bulk, and somehow this small detail felt revealing in a way I couldn't quite articulate. His apartment was a mirror image of mine, but felt completely different. Where my place was sparse, almost aggressively minimal, the home of someone who'd never quite committed to the idea of permanence, Mark's space felt lived in, comfortable. There were bookshelves along one wall, packed with what looked like a mix of fiction and technical manuals, and a guitar leaning against the window that caught my attention immediately. "You play?" I asked, nodding toward the instrument. "A little," Mark said, following my gaze. "Nothing fancy. It's mostly for when I can't sleep." He paused, then added, "The neighbors don't seem to mind as long as I keep it quiet." I wanted to ask more. What kind of music he played, how long he'd been playing, whether the sleeplessness was a regular problem. But something about his manner suggested these weren't questions for a first conversation with a near stranger. Instead, I accepted the phone he offered and dialed my landlord's number, which I'd memorized after the last time I'd locked myself out. While the phone rang, I took in more details of Mark's apartment. The furniture was simple but well chosen. A comfortable-looking couch in dark gray, a coffee table that showed the rings of many mugs, a desk by the window with a laptop and neat stacks of papers. It was the home of someone who'd given thought to how he wanted to live, who'd made deliberate choices about his environment. My landlord's voicemail picked up after 6 rings, and I left a message explaining my situation. When I hung up, Mark was in the kitchen area, filling a kettle with water. "Coffee? Tea?" he asked. "Might be a while before he calls back." I almost said no. It was my default response to offers of hospitality, part of my lifelong practice of taking up as little space as possible in other people's lives. But something made me hesitate. Maybe the way the light from his kitchen window caught the silver in his hair, or the fact that his offer seemed genuinely casual, not the kind of forced politeness that made me feel like a burden. "Tea would be nice," I said, "if it's not too much trouble." "No trouble at all," Mark replied, and I could tell he meant it. "I was about to make some anyway." He moved around the small kitchen with an efficiency that suggested routine, pulling down 2 mugs, digging through a cabinet for tea bags. I found myself watching his hands again, the way they handled objects with unconscious care, never rushing, never fumbling. There was something hypnotic about it, the quiet competence of someone comfortable in his own space. "So you work downtown?" Mark asked as he waited for the water to boil, not looking at me directly, but somehow making the question feel natural rather than like forced small talk. "Yeah, graphic design," I said. "Nothing too exciting. Corporate stuff mostly. Logos, brochures, the occasional website. You?" "Software development," he said, and there was something in his tone that suggested this wasn't his favorite topic. "Not as glamorous as it sounds." The kettle began to whistle, and Mark poured water over tea bags in both mugs. The steam rose between us, carrying the earthy scent of what smelled like Earl Grey, and for a moment the kitchen felt smaller, more intimate, like we were sharing something more significant than just waiting for my landlord to call back. "Milk? Sugar?" Mark asked, holding up a small ceramic pitcher and a bowl of sugar cubes. "Just milk, thanks," I said, and watched as he added a splash to my mug before sliding it across the counter to me. Our fingers brushed for just a second when I took it, and I felt an unexpected jolt of awareness. Not attraction, exactly, or not just attraction, but something more complex. Recognition, maybe. The sense that this person, this stranger who'd invited me into his home without hesitation, might understand something about the weight of being alone that most people didn't. We moved to the living room, settling on opposite ends of the couch with our mugs. The distance felt carefully calibrated, close enough to talk comfortably, far enough to maintain the polite boundaries appropriate for strangers. But I found myself acutely aware of the space between us, the way the couch cushions dipped slightly under our weight, the sound of Mark's breathing in the quiet apartment. "So," Mark said after we'd both taken a few sips of tea, "graphic design. Did you always want to do that, or is it one of those things you fell into?" It was a simple question, but something about the way he asked it, genuinely curious, not just making conversation, made me consider my answer more carefully than I usually did. "Fell into, I guess," I said finally. "I was decent at art in college, and when I graduated I needed a job that would pay the rent. It seemed like a reasonable compromise between creativity and stability." I paused, surprised by my own honesty. "What about you?" "Software development by choice or by accident." Mark's smile was rueful. "Definitely by accident. I actually wanted to be a teacher, believe it or not. English literature. But when I graduated, the job market was—" He trailed off, shrugging. "Well, let's just say I had student loans to pay off and programming paid better than substitute teaching." "Do you ever think about going back to it?" I asked. "Teaching, I mean." "Sometimes," Mark said, and there was something wistful in his voice. "There's this fantasy I have sometimes, where I'm standing in front of a classroom talking about Steinbeck or Morrison, watching kids' faces when they finally get why a book matters. But then reality kicks in, and I remember mortgage payments and health insurance and all the practical reasons why it's probably too late to change course now." I understood that feeling more than I wanted to admit. The sense of being trapped by your own practical choices, of watching your younger self's dreams recede like objects in a rearview mirror. We sat in comfortable silence for a moment, both lost in our own thoughts, and I realized this was the longest conversation I'd had with anyone outside of work in weeks. "What about music?" I asked, nodding toward the guitar. "Is that a recent thing, or have you been playing for a while?" Mark's face softened slightly. "Since college, on and off. I'm not very good, but there's something about it." He paused, seeming to search for the right words. "It's honest, you know. When you hit a wrong note, you hear it immediately. There's no hiding behind clever design or elegant code. It's just you and the sound you're making." I found myself nodding, even though I'd never played an instrument in my life. But I understood the appeal of something direct, something that couldn't be edited or revised or perfected through endless iteration, something that demanded presence in the moment. My phone, which I'd plugged into Mark's charger, buzzed against the coffee table. My landlord, finally calling back. The conversation was brief and practical. He could meet me at the building in about an hour with a spare key, apologetic but not particularly concerned. These things happened, apparently. When I hung up, Mark was looking at me expectantly. "He'll be here in an hour," I said, and immediately felt the awkwardness of the situation settling over me like a heavy blanket. An hour was long enough to feel like an imposition, but not long enough to justify leaving and coming back. We were trapped together in polite limbo, two strangers who'd exhausted the easy topics of conversation and were now faced with either going deeper or enduring 60 minutes of increasingly stilted small talk. "Well," Mark said, and I could see him calculating the same social mathematics I was wrestling with. "You're welcome to stay, obviously. Or if you'd rather walk around the neighborhood, kill some time." "I don't want to impose," I said automatically, the phrase so familiar it felt like muscle memory. "You're not imposing," Mark replied, and something in his tone made me look at him more carefully. "Honestly, it's nice to have company. I don't get a lot of visitors." There was something vulnerable in that admission, a crack in the careful politeness we'd been maintaining. I found myself studying his face, noting the fine lines around his eyes, the way he held his shoulders as if he was used to carrying weight alone. "Me neither," I said quietly. "Visitors, I mean." Mark smiled, and for the first time since we'd met, it was completely unguarded. "Well then, I guess we're both due for some practice at being social." The next hour unfolded in a way that felt both natural and surprising. We talked about books. Mark had excellent taste and strong opinions about contemporary fiction. We discussed the neighborhood, comparing notes about the best coffee shop. We disagreed, and the worst laundromat. Unanimous. We found common ground in our shared frustration with the city's public transportation and our mutual love of old movies. But it was the spaces between conversation that felt most significant. The comfortable silences when we both sipped our tea and looked out Mark's window at the lights beginning to come on in the apartments across the street. The way he laughed, quietly, mostly to himself, when I told him about my coworker who brought her lunch in a different themed lunchbox every day. The moments when our eyes met accidentally and held for just a beat longer than politeness required. I found myself noticing details I had no business noticing. The way Mark's sweater brought out the green in his eyes. How he had a small scar on his left hand that he touched unconsciously when he was thinking. The fact that he kept his books organized by author rather than genre, which somehow felt revealing of a mind that valued order, but understood that creativity couldn't be categorized. When my phone rang again, my landlord announcing his arrival, I felt a strange pang of disappointment. The evening had taken on a quality I hadn't expected, a sense of suspended time that made the prospect of returning to my own apartment feel suddenly lonely. "That's me," I said, standing up and immediately regretting the movement. The couch had been comfortable, and Mark's presence had been, well, comfortable too in a way I wasn't used to experiencing with people I'd just met. "Of course," Mark said, standing as well. "I hope you can get back in okay." We moved toward the door, and I realized I was trying to walk more slowly than necessary, drawing out these last moments in a way that probably seemed obvious. At the door, I turned to face him, acutely aware that we were standing closer than we had all evening, close enough that I could smell his cologne, something subtle and woody that made me want to lean in rather than step back. "Thank you," I said. "For the tea and the phone and just—" I gestured vaguely, unable to articulate exactly what I was grateful for. The kindness, maybe, or the ease of his company, or the simple fact that for an hour I'd felt less alone than I had in months. "Any time," Mark said. And then, as I was reaching for the door handle, he spoke again, his voice softer than it had been all evening. "You don't have to go yet, if you don't want to." The words hung in the air between us, loaded with a meaning I couldn't quite decipher but could definitely feel. There was something in his tone, not quite hopeful, not quite resigned, but somewhere in between. A question disguised as a statement, an invitation wrapped in the safety of plausible deniability. I stood there with my hand on the door handle, feeling the weight of the moment settling around us like dust in a sunbeam. My landlord was waiting downstairs, probably checking his watch and wondering what was taking so long. My apartment was just next door, just a few minutes away from the familiar solitude I'd been craving all day. The practical thing, the sensible thing, would be to leave now, to thank Mark again and disappear back into my own life with nothing more than a pleasant memory of an unexpected evening. But there was something in the way he was looking at me, something in the careful distance he maintained even as he made the offer, that made me hesitate. Something that suggested this moment mattered more than either of us was willing to admit, that walking out that door might mean losing something I didn't even know I'd been looking for. The silence stretched between us, heavy with possibility and uncertainty, and I realized that whatever I decided in the next few seconds would change something, maybe everything, about the careful, quiet life I'd built for myself. The weight of that choice settled over me like a physical thing, and for the first time in years I felt truly awake. The silence stretched between us like a held breath, heavy with the weight of his words still hanging in the air. "You don't have to go yet, if you don't want to." My hand remained frozen on the door handle, caught between the momentum of leaving and the magnetic pull of staying, of discovering what lay beneath the careful politeness we'd maintained all evening. I could hear my landlord's footsteps in the hallway downstairs, probably wondering what was taking so long, probably checking his phone and calculating how much longer this would take out of his Tuesday evening routine. The practical part of my mind, the part that had kept me safe and small and uncomplicated for 28 years, was already composing my apology, already reaching for the easy escape of social obligation. But there was something in Mark's voice, something in the way he'd spoken those words, not quite a question, not quite a statement, but something more vulnerable than either. A crack in the careful armor of politeness that had protected us both through the evening's conversation. I turned back to face him, my hand falling away from the door handle, and found him watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. There was hope there, but tempered with the kind of careful resignation that spoke of someone who'd learned not to expect too much from moments like this. Someone who understood that reaching out was always a risk, that the space between offering and accepting was vast and uncertain territory. I started, then stopped, unsure how to articulate the strange pull I felt toward this man I barely knew. "My landlord is waiting." It wasn't quite a no, but it wasn't a yes either, and I could see Mark processing this, weighing the implications. He nodded slowly, and I caught a flicker of something, disappointment maybe, cross his features before he schooled them back into polite acceptance. "Of course," he said. "I understand." But I didn't move toward the door again. Instead, I found myself studying his face in the soft light of his living room, noting the way the shadows fell across his cheekbones, the slight furrow between his brows that suggested he was thinking carefully about something he wasn't saying. The words came out before I'd fully formed the thought. I could text him. Tell him I'll be a few more minutes. Mark's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a loosening around his eyes that might have been relief. "Only if you want to," he said, but there was something in his tone that suggested it mattered more than he was letting on. I pulled out my phone and sent a quick message to my landlord. "Sorry, running a few minutes late. Be right down." And then turned back to Mark, acutely aware that I'd just chosen something I didn't fully understand over something safe and predictable. "So," I said, feeling suddenly awkward now that I'd committed to staying. "What now?" Mark smiled, and for the first time all evening, it reached his eyes completely. "Now we figure it out as we go." He moved back toward the living room, and I followed, noticing details I'd missed before. The way he favored his right leg slightly when he walked, as if an old injury still bothered him sometimes. The stack of vinyl records beside his stereo, their spines worn with handling, a coffee mug on the kitchen counter with the logo of what looked like a small liberal arts college. "More tea?" Mark asked, already moving toward the kitchen. "Or something stronger?" "I think I have some wine somewhere." "Wine sounds good," I said, surprised by my own answer. I rarely drank, especially not with people I'd just met, but something about this evening felt outside the normal rules of social interaction. Something that called for small risks, small rebellions against my usual careful ways. Mark rummaged through a cabinet and emerged with a bottle of red wine, something with a simple label that suggested good taste without pretension. He opened it with practiced efficiency, and I found myself watching his hands again, the way they moved with quiet competence around objects. There was something hypnotic about it, the unconscious grace of someone comfortable in his own space. He poured 2 glasses and handed me one, our fingers brushing again in that moment of exchange. This time I didn't pull away immediately, letting the contact linger for just a heartbeat longer than necessary. His skin was warm, slightly rough at the fingertips in a way that suggested he worked with his hands for more than just typing at a keyboard. Mark paused, holding his glass halfway to his lips, searching for the right words. "To unexpected evenings." "To locked doors," I replied, surprising myself with the attempt at humor. We touched glasses with a soft clink, and I took a sip of wine that tasted better than anything I'd had in months. It was rich and complex, with layers of flavor that unfolded slowly on my tongue, and I realized Mark was the type of person who chose things carefully, who valued quality over convenience even in small matters. We settled back onto the couch, but this time the distance between us felt different, charged with possibility rather than mere politeness. The wine had loosened something in me, or maybe it was simply the weight of the decision to stay, to choose this moment over the familiar safety of my own apartment. "Can I ask you something?" Mark said, swirling his wine gently in his glass. I nodded, though something in his tone made me brace myself. "Earlier, when you said you don't get many visitors..." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "Is that by choice or by circumstance?" It was a more personal question than we'd ventured into before, and I felt the familiar urge to deflect, to offer a surface answer that would protect the deeper truths I'd learned to keep hidden. But there was something about the way Mark had asked it, something in his patient waiting for my response, that made me want to be honest. "Both, I guess," I said finally. "It started as circumstance. I moved here for work, didn't know anyone. Found it hard to make friends as an adult. But somewhere along the way it became a choice, or at least a habit. It's easier to be alone than to risk." I trailed off, unsure how to finish the sentence. "Risk what?" Mark prompted gently. "Disappointing people, I suppose. Or being disappointed by them." I took another sip of wine, feeling the warmth spread through my chest. It sounds pathetic when I say it out loud. "It doesn't sound pathetic," Mark said, and there was something in his voice that made me look up at him. "It sounds familiar." We sat in silence for a moment, both lost in our own thoughts, and I found myself studying the way the lamplight played across Mark's features, softening the lines around his eyes and highlighting the silver threads in his hair. There was something beautiful about him, but it was a quiet kind of beauty, the kind that revealed itself slowly, through observation and attention rather than immediate impact. "What about you?" I asked. "The not having visitors thing, choice or circumstance?" Mark's smile was rueful. "Definitely choice, though it started as circumstance. I moved here about 5 years ago after..." He paused, staring into his wine glass as if it might contain the words he was looking for. "After a relationship ended badly, the kind of ending that makes you question everything you thought you knew about yourself." I waited, sensing there was more he wanted to say, but wasn't sure how to voice. "His name was James," Mark continued, and I felt something shift in the air between us. Not surprise exactly, because I'd suspected, but a kind of recognition. a piece of a puzzle clicking into place. We were together for 3 years, lived together for 2. I thought we were building something real, something that would last. But it turned out we had very different ideas about what that meant. There was pain in his voice, carefully controlled but still audible, and I found myself leaning slightly forward, drawn by the vulnerability of his admission. He was... Mark searched for words. Controlling, I guess, though I didn't see it that way at the time. He had opinions about everything, how I dressed, what I ate, who I spent time with, what music I listened to. At first I thought it meant he cared, that he was invested in our life together. It took me a long time to realize that what I thought was love was actually just management. I felt something tighten in my chest, a recognition of pain I'd never experienced but somehow understood. How did it end? Badly, Mark said with a bitter laugh. I finally worked up the courage to push back on something. I can't even remember what it was now, something small. And he exploded. Called me selfish, ungrateful, told me I'd never find anyone who would put up with me the way he had. The worst part was, for a while I believed him. The silence that followed felt heavy with the weight of old wounds, and I found myself wanting to reach out, to offer some kind of comfort, but uncertain how or whether it would be welcome. I'm sorry, I said finally, the words feeling inadequate but necessary. It was a long time ago, Mark replied, but something in his voice suggested the healing was still ongoing. The thing is, it made me realize how much of myself I'd lost trying to be what he wanted me to be. It took me years to remember who I was before him, to trust my own instincts again. Is that why you moved here? Mark nodded. Fresh start, clean slate, all those cliches, but also because I needed to prove to myself that I could build a life on my own terms, without having to negotiate every decision with someone who thought they knew better than I did what was good for me. I understood that impulse more than I wanted to admit. My own solitude hadn't been born from the ashes of a relationship, but it came from a similar place, the desire to control the variables, to create a life small and manageable enough that disappointment became unlikely. And have you? I asked. Built the life you wanted, I mean. Mark considered this, swirling his wine thoughtfully. In some ways, yes. I have work I'm reasonably good at, a place I like living, hobbies that bring me joy. But... He paused, meeting my eyes with a directness that made my breath catch slightly. I've realized that building a life entirely on your own terms can be another kind of prison. Safer, maybe, but still limiting. The weight of his words settled between us, and I felt the truth of them in a way that was almost physical. We'd both chosen safety over possibility, solitude over the messy complexity of human connection, and while there was wisdom in that choice, there was also a kind of slow starvation. Outside, it had started to rain, a gentle patter against the windows that seemed to wrap Mark's apartment in a cocoon of intimacy. The sound was soothing, hypnotic, and it made the space between us feel even more removed from the ordinary world. Listen to that, Mark said, tilting his head toward the window. I love the sound of rain on glass. It makes everything feel suspended, like time moves differently when it's raining. I listened, letting the rhythm of the rain wash over me, and realized he was right. There was something about the sound that changed the quality of the moment, made it feel both more intimate and more significant. As if the rain was giving us permission to exist outside normal social boundaries, to explore the strange chemistry that had been building between us all evening. Do you ever miss it? I asked, surprising myself with the question. Being with someone, I mean. Mark was quiet for so long I began to wonder if I'd overstepped some invisible boundary. But when he finally answered, his voice was soft, thoughtful. Yes and no, he said. I miss the good parts, having someone to share things with, the comfort of not always being alone with your thoughts, the way another person can surprise you, show you parts of yourself you didn't know existed. But I don't miss the compromise, the constant negotiation of needs and wants. I don't miss feeling like I had to justify my choices to someone else." He paused, taking a sip of wine, and when he continued, his voice was even quieter. "Though lately I've been wondering if maybe I threw out the baby with the bathwater, you know? If maybe the problem wasn't intimacy itself, but just the wrong kind of intimacy, the wrong person." Something in the way he said it, the careful way he wasn't quite looking at me, made my heart speed up. There was an implication in his words, a suggestion that felt both thrilling and terrifying. "What about you?" Mark asked, turning the question back to me. "Have you ever been in love?" The question caught me off guard, partly because of its directness and partly because of how difficult it was to answer honestly. "I thought I was once," I said slowly. "In college. Her name was Sarah, and she was everything I thought I wanted. Smart, funny, beautiful in this effortless way that made me feel lucky just to be noticed by her." Mark's expression didn't change, but I caught something in his eyes, a flicker of, what? Disappointment? Surprise? I couldn't tell. "What happened?" he asked, and his voice was carefully neutral. "Nothing dramatic," I said. "We dated for about a year, and it was nice, comfortable. But looking back, I think I was more in love with the idea of being in love than I was with her specifically. I was trying so hard to feel what I thought I was supposed to feel that I never stopped to consider what I actually did feel." I paused, realizing I was approaching territory I'd never really examined, let alone discussed with anyone else. The relationship ended when she graduated and moved across the country for graduate school. We promised to try long distance, but it faded pretty quickly. I told myself I was heartbroken, but honestly, I think I was mostly just confused about why it had felt so much like playing a role instead of living a life. Mark was watching me intently now, and I could feel heat creeping up my neck as I realized how much I'd revealed. "Have there been others since then?" he asked. "A few dates here and there, nothing serious. I kept thinking I'd figure it out eventually, that maybe I just wasn't good at relationships, or maybe I hadn't met the right person yet. But the more time passed, the more I started to wonder if maybe I was just different. If maybe I was one of those people who was meant to be alone." The words hung in the air between us, and I immediately regretted them. They sounded self-pitying, pathetic, the kind of thing that made people uncomfortable and eager to change the subject. But Mark didn't look uncomfortable. He looked thoughtful, understanding, as if he recognized something in my words that resonated with his own experience. "Can I tell you something?" he said, leaning forward slightly. When I was trying to figure out why my relationship with James felt so wrong, so forced, I spent a lot of time wondering if maybe I just wasn't cut out for love. If maybe there was something missing in me, some capacity for connection that other people had, but I didn't. He paused, running a hand through his hair, and I found myself mesmerized by the gesture, by the way the lamplight caught the silver threads. It took me years to realize that the problem wasn't that I couldn't love. The problem was that I was trying to love in a way that didn't fit who I actually was. I was performing love instead of living it. Our eyes met, and I felt something pass between us, recognition, understanding, the acknowledgement of a shared experience that neither of us had been able to articulate before. "The thing is," Mark continued, his voice dropping to almost a whisper, "tonight, sitting here with you, I'm remembering what it feels like when connection happens naturally, when you're not trying to force yourself into a shape that doesn't fit." The air between us seemed to thicken, charged with the weight of his words and the implications they carried. I felt my pulse quicken, not with anxiety, but with a kind of anticipation I'd never experienced before. "Mark," I started, but I didn't know how to finish the sentence. Didn't know how to voice the strange mixture of fear and longing that was building in my chest. "I know," he said softly. "This is unexpected." We sat in silence for a moment, both of us processing what had just been acknowledged without being directly stated. The rain continued its gentle percussion against the windows, and I became acutely aware of everything: the warmth of the wine in my system, the soft lighting that made Mark's apartment feel like a world apart from reality, the way Mark's presence beside me felt both comfortable and electrically charged. "I should probably go," I said, but my voice lacked conviction. "Probably," Mark agreed, but he didn't move, and neither did I. Instead, we sat there in the growing intimacy of the moment, both of us seeming to understand that something significant was happening, something that couldn't be rushed or forced or easily defined. Mark reached for the wine bottle and topped off both our glasses, and I noticed that his hand was slightly unsteady. It was reassuring to realize that whatever this was, whatever was building between us, he was feeling it too. "Tell me something else," Mark said, settling back against the couch. "Something you've never told anyone." The request was bold, intimate in a way that should have made me defensive. But instead, I found myself wanting to meet his honesty with my own. "I'm afraid of being forgotten," I said, the words coming out before I could stop them. "Not famous forgotten, but personally forgotten. I'm afraid that I'll go through my entire life without making a real impression on anyone, without mattering enough to someone that they'd miss me if I wasn't there anymore." Mark was quiet, absorbing this, and I felt a flash of vulnerability that made me want to take the words back. "Your turn," I said quickly, deflecting before he could respond. Mark smiled slightly, recognizing the deflection but allowing it. "I'm afraid of wanting too much," he said, "of caring about something or someone so much that losing it would break something in me that couldn't be fixed." His admission hit me with unexpected force, and I realized that beneath his careful composure, Mark carried the same fundamental loneliness that had shaped my own life. The same fear of reaching out only to be disappointed, the same protective instincts that kept us safe but also kept us isolated. "That's why you don't have visitors," I said, understanding flooding through me. "And why you keep to yourself," Mark replied, recognizing the same truth. We looked at each other across the small space of the couch, and I felt something shift, some barrier dissolving in the face of mutual recognition. Without fully deciding to do it, I found myself moving closer, closing the careful distance we'd maintained all evening. Mark didn't pull away. If anything, he leaned slightly toward me, and suddenly we were close enough that I could see the flecks of gold in his hazel eyes, could smell the subtle scent of his cologne mixed with wine and something indefinably him. "David," he said quietly, and my name in his voice sounded different than it ever had before, weighted with meaning, soft with possibility. I don't know who moved first. Maybe we both did, drawn together by the same magnetic pull that had been building all evening. But suddenly his hand was on my knee, warm and solid and real, and I was reaching up to touch his face, my fingertips tracing the line of his jaw. His skin was softer than I'd expected, with the slight roughness of evening stubble that made me want to explore further. Our faces were inches apart now, and I could feel his breath warm against my lips, could see the way his pupils had dilated in the lamplight. "Is this okay?" Mark whispered, and the question was so gentle, so careful, that it made something tight in my chest finally loosen. Instead of answering with words, I closed the remaining distance between us, pressing my lips to his in a kiss that was tentative at first, uncertain, but quickly deepened as we both discovered that this, whatever this was, felt more right than anything either of us had experienced in longer than we could remember. Mark's lips were soft, warm, and he tasted like wine and possibility. The kiss was slow, exploratory, filled with a kind of desperate tenderness that spoke of how long we'd both been waiting for something real, something that didn't require performance or pretense. When we finally pulled apart, our foreheads remained touching, both of us breathing slightly harder than normal, The silence between us now was different than any we'd shared before, charged not with uncertainty but with recognition, with the acknowledgement of something that had shifted permanently. "I haven't done this in a long time," Mark said quietly, and I could hear both vulnerability and wonder in his voice. "Neither have I," I replied, and realized it was true in more ways than one. I'd never kissed anyone and felt this sense of rightness, this feeling of pieces clicking into place. We stayed close, foreheads still touching, hands still connected, and I felt like I was discovering something fundamental about myself that I'd never known was missing. The rain continued outside, wrapping us in its gentle rhythm, and I thought about how just a few hours ago I'd been locked out of my apartment, frustrated and alone, with no idea that my entire understanding of myself was about to shift. Mark's thumb traced small circles on my knee, an unconscious gesture that sent warmth spreading through my entire body. I'd never been touched with such care, such attention, such obvious desire to simply be close without rushing toward something more. "What happens now?" I asked, voicing the question that hung between us. Mark smiled, and this time it was completely unguarded, filled with a joy I suspected he rarely let himself feel. "I don't know," he said, "but for the first time in years, I'm not afraid of not knowing." We settled back against the couch, this time with no careful distance between us. Mark's arm came around my shoulders, and I let myself lean into his warmth, marveling at how natural it felt, how right. Outside, the rain had intensified, drumming against the windows with increasing urgency. But inside, we were warm and safe and suspended in this moment that felt both fragile and infinitely precious. "I should call my landlord back," I murmured, but made no move to reach for my phone. "Probably," Mark agreed, but his arm tightened slightly around me. We both knew I wasn't going anywhere tonight. The thought should have terrified me. I'd never been someone who made impulsive decisions, never been comfortable with uncertainty. But lying there against Mark's chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath my ear, I felt something I'd never experienced before, the absolute certainty that whatever came next, I wanted to discover it with him. The wine and the warmth and the emotional intensity of the evening were making me drowsy, and I felt my eyes growing heavy. Mark's breathing had grown deeper and more regular beneath me, and his hand had stilled where it rested on my shoulder. As sleep began to pull me under, I thought about how this morning I'd woken up alone in my own bed, went to work at a job that barely engaged me, came home to an apartment that felt more like a waiting room than a home. And now, just hours later, everything had changed. Not dramatically, not with fireworks or grand gestures, but quietly, profoundly, in the way that real change always happens, slowly, then all at once. Mark murmured something in his sleep, and I felt him shift slightly, pulling me closer. The rain continued its gentle lullaby against the windows, and I let myself sink deeper into his warmth, into this moment of perfect, terrifying, beautiful uncertainty. Tomorrow would bring questions, complications, the need to figure out what this meant and where it might lead. But tonight we had this, the sound of rain, the warmth of unexpected connection, and the fragile, precious hope that maybe, just maybe, we'd both found something worth the risk of wanting. I closed my eyes and let sleep take me, safe in Mark's arms and wrapped in the rhythm of the rain, knowing that when I woke up, the world would be different. We would be different. And for the first time in my adult life, I wasn't afraid of that change. I was eager to see what it might bring.